Welcome to the latest edition of the Event Management Podcast from the Event Management Journal. We're here this week with Leonie. My name's James Cannell. I'm your co-host along with Alan File. Hi, Alan.
Hi, James. Morning and evening, Leonie.
Yeah. Good evening, Leonie. We were just talking about how we're all in different time zones. So thank you very much for giving up some of your evening for us. Leonie, we're going to be talking today about your paper that's just about to be published in Event Management, which is called An Investigation of the Rotation Patterns of International Association Meetings and Events, which you've written with Martin Robertson, Colin Drake, and Jenny Dung Lee. So thank you very much for this. It's a fascinating paper. We've been looking forward to talking with you about it. Maybe you could start off by just telling our listeners a little bit about you, where you're from, what you're working on at the moment, and we'll start the conversation there.
Thanks, James. So for the listeners, my name is Leonie Lockstone Binney. I'm based at Griffith University in Australia, specifically on the Gold Coast, within the Department of Tourism, Sport and Hotel Management. So I'm a professor in the department. I primarily teach into our event management program. We have a major in our Bachelor of Business. And I also do a lot of work in the event space on different topics. Business events is one of them. I do a lot of stuff also on legacies and impacts, and have done over the years of teaching into the event space, also research on scholarship and teaching and learning in events as well. So that's a bit of a background.
Fab, thank you. And how did you end up in events? What got you into this area? Because we've all got different stories of how we ended up here. What's yours?
Yeah, well, I think we might all have a similar story. I've been teaching into events since 2006, and I recently at that time finished a PhD, and my topic was volunteering in museums. So my sort of degree background were all tourism degrees, so Generation T. And of course, completing the PhD, and I'm wondering what was next. So I did have a short-term teaching contract in Perth, and the opportunity arose to come back to my hometown of Melbourne and to teach into this new program at Victoria University, which was event management, not really knowing what event management was and what event management as a degree might be, but it was very early days, so that was 2006. So I think at the time it was the second degree program in events in Australia. It was all very new, and probably at the start I was 1 week ahead of the students, and from there, but looking back, and I actually, the things we sort of forget along the way, I'd worked at an art centre, and I was a venue and functions manager, and all of these things that at the time I really didn't think were part of the event sector, but they were. So that's how I got into the event management space, and I've really enjoyed working in it over these subsequent years.
It's interesting, Leonie, isn't it? Because I think, as you said, we've all come through a similar non-traditional route. And I guess I'd forgotten that you were at VU. So you were really at VU when a lot of this work was really flying. That took 15, 16 years ago.
Yes, yeah, I had the privilege of working with Leo, Jago, and Mark Deary. Mark was my PhD supervisor. So was Brian King. And not that I did my PhD, I didn't do my PhD in the event space at all, but probably my carry through has been the fact that I did it on volunteering. So subsequently, I've done a lot of work on event volunteering, and that's been a really great space to work into because it's quite different from other forms of tourism volunteering, and it's a new space as well, so probably quite early into that area, so that's been good.
Yeah. At the time, a really, really strong team down there.
Yes.
And a fun team as well. A fun
team. And they're great colleagues, and I count them all as mentors, and I continue to go back to that team on an occasional basis, and they've always been a great support.
Wonderful. So volunteering, Leonie, how did you get to what is a fascinating subject of event rotation? What's the connection between the two, if any?
Probably a very limited connection on that one. I think certainly since I teach into event management, I've always felt it's very important that I have a program of research that also relates to events. Now, some of that relates to volunteering, some of that's, of course, not related to volunteering. Some of that's, I'd say, I was going to say strategic versus pragmatic. I'd probably say a lot of it's been pragmatic along the way, but in respect to this particular paper, your question forced me to think back as to how it came about. And I did have the opportunity of attending in 2013 the ICA Congress in Shanghai. And at that time, we were doing some work with ICA, as I said, at Victoria University, and we had a membership of ICA. And that gave us the opportunity to send some students on a scholarship program, and I had the opportunity to go along as an educator, a lecturer, and see that program in action. And I just happened to attend a session at that Congress, which was the research analysts from ICA. They were talking about this database that they had. And I just thought, wow, this database of 20,000 events, so association events that they've been capturing data on since 1972. And that's every iteration of those association events and their whole history tracked. I just thought, well, what a fantastic resource to do research based on. And, it probably had that thought for quite a while before actually acting on it. Subsequently, we had the opportunity through a colleague, Colin, who's still at Victoria University, and Victoria University was still a member of ICA, to access some data, and we approached ICA. I should say ICA have always been great to work with, so they're very supportive of research, regardless of probably whether the university is a member of ICA or not. They're always supportive, so just the opportunity to take advantage of that and really looking at what was out there in terms of understanding the hosting of these types of events. So a lot of standalone studies looking at one destination and why an event might go to one destination versus another destination, but not really taking into account the global ecosystem, I should say, of how these events rotate globally and around the world. And particularly we're interested in looking at how the past history of where these events have been held might not predict, because our data can't do that, but might give an indication of where these events might be held into the future.
Well, can we just take a ICA, International Conferences and Conventions
Association, yes.
Yeah. Could we maybe just talk? Why is it important to look at association events? Because I think you talked about teaching events. We've all taught events. I think that's something that we often don't cover very much in our curriculum as association events. Why is it so useful to look at those?
It's a huge industry, as you know, and it's one of the things when I'm always talking to our students in the event management space. So when they come into the classroom, we'll often say, well, what do you want to do? What type of events do you want to work in? And often a lot of it's music festivals and sort of shows and events. And we sort of suggest that great areas of the events sector to work into, not to disparage those in any way, but often students aren't aware, as you're just indicating, James, of opportunities in the business event space. And that those employment opportunities are often, like with PCOs, destination management organisations, they're often more ongoing forms of employment, which might be of interest to potential graduates from an event management program. So not just economic impact alone of these events. As we know, they're they're very competitively bid for. The research indicates that once they're in the destination, they're higher yield type events, so people don't stay for as long, but they spend more.
More
So
when they're there.
there is this sort of global jockeying for who's going to host them. But for our students, we also like to indicate the diversity of the sector and those opportunities that are available.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I agree 100% with what you've said. I had no idea about the scope of association events till I came to the United States. They are just massive in every way. And I think that for the students, the job opportunity, the diversity of jobs is impressive, actually.
Yeah.
But you just have no, it's this huge world that just exists. And then when you tap into it, it's like, wow, it really is. It is a monster in many ways.
It is.
Well, what do we learn about the rotation? Because I see how things work here, and it really is a fascinating. Again, I had no idea how interesting it was till you start looking at this stuff. What do you learn about rotation from your work? Because you've had a really big and interesting data set. But what
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that data set as well, because it's clearly something really special about this article.
Monster, yeah.
It could be bigger, but as I said, the ICA database has 20,000 events and it has a very long history of those events over time. So, of course, in conducting this study, we had to sample, and our initial parameters is we wanted to sample between 40 to 50 associations, and then from the associations track their events over a 10-year period. So effectively, that's what we have. We have data from 43 associations tracking their events over a 10-year period. And that is, I think from memory, 236 events conducted between 2009 and 2019. So definitely a pre-COVID analysis. And really, I should also say we sampled a particular sector. So ICA they classify their events according to industry sector. This one was in the law sector, so we do suggest that the findings might not necessarily be generalisable, and certainly more research is needed. But really, it was quite interesting. So I think the findings probably have confirmed a lot of intuitive patterns around rotation, so things that probably were suspected anecdotally but were not previously confirmed with longitudinal data. So certainly some of those larger events, of course, the fact that they're going more widely than more regional type events. But we also saw differences in patterns. So one of the things we could do with our data is, because we had the location of the association awarding the rights to host the events, we could then compare that to where the events are actually being hosted. And there were some differences in that respect, so which I found to actually be quite interesting. So, for example, European associations, based on our data, were more willing to spread the hosting of their events. So they're more willing to go to the Americas, within Europe, to Asia, Africa, Australia, compared to the American associations, which were very much quite parochial in terms of where they were doing their hosting, and overwhelmingly the majority of American associations were hosting their events within the same continent. So there's geographic differences which, if you're a convention bureau, if you have some understanding of those and how they might impact those potential events that you determine to bid for, then that's important information to have in your hands, and might then determine which events are worthwhile or have merit to bid for, as opposed to those that you just pass on and direct your effort elsewhere.
I wonder why that. I mean, I know this goes beyond the scope of your data, but I wonder why that is, that American associations stick in the US. What's your gut feeling on that? Is it just because America's so big and they've got more choice, or is there something underlying that, do you think?
I really don't know, and I'm no expert at all on the American business event sector. And Alan, if you have any insights to share.
Yeah.
Funny enough, my take, it's for the majority of cases, it comes down to the time factor. So, if you're working in a typical US environment, timing is everything. So it's like their vacation. They have shorter vacations generally.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So a lot of it's timing. So they'll have a 2 or 3 day trip. You can squeeze a lot more in if you go to Chicago than you can if you go into Bali. So I think a lot of it is just timing. And also a lot of the events, and it's integral to rotation, I think there's sweeteners and incentives to stay local so that they get a much, much bigger deal. And I think one other thing, and I think it was to one of your findings, a lot of the association events here, they're huge. They're absolutely massive. So much of the rest of the world doesn't have the scale of what you have here. So everything's just very, very big. So they can't find the space. Yes, there are some places, but there's not many. I'm in Orlando, so it's the second largest one in the country. It's just enormous. And even that's not big enough sometimes for some of these things. So
Wow.
it's partly a time factor and it's partly a scale factor.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And as you also said, the fact that they do have that infrastructure at scale, so they can host events of those sizes. So, yes, I mean, our data couldn't get to that. And I think that's the next stage in terms of really progressing work in this area. I think it's a worthwhile area, and whether it's analysing and doing further analysis of the ICA database or looking at other sources of data similarly, but really having an understanding of how these events are moving globally, that acknowledges that there is a global ecosystem, and that if the event's held in one destination, that means it's not being held somewhere else. So therefore, there's benefits and costs associated with that. And I don't think we've done a lot of research that really looks at it at a global level.
Okay. So I'm just processing that. I think you're absolutely right. That isn't something that really occurred to me before. You're absolutely right that we're so destination focused that the idea of partnering or doing collaborative research between just two places is hard enough. Thinking about it at the global level, I think would be. I'd love to read that. I don't think I've got that. I don't think I can do that. But
Work through the data.
it's just blown my mind. But I'd love to. I hope someone else does that and I can read it. You talked about where you could go next. Was there anything that jumped out in your research that was particularly surprising, shocking, confusing, where you think, oh, we could go and find out more about that?
Probably that thing about these differences around associations. So I think maybe the next step is to interview associations and then go back to some of their decision making as to where they decide to host events. And even I should say, one reviewer for the paper, right in the final round of review, made a really insightful comment, but just to say that some of the associations actually might have within their statutes that they are actually servicing a particular geographic location or area. So they can't actually go outside of that area. So even to do that analysis and to go back and look at the association statutes to see what impact that might have on rotations, to my knowledge, that work hasn't been done. So there's definitely lots of avenues, and if researchers are interested in this area, and if they're wanting to do more analysis with the ICA database, then I would just suggest reaching out to them. I think they're very supportive of research. Just last week, my colleague Colin pointed out that our paper had been published to ICA, and it was mentioned at AIM, which is our sort of Australian big business events annual buyer-seller forum. So it was mentioned there. So they're very positive about supporting research.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting here. We're all from countries where there's political polarization, but the US is probably a little bit more extreme. Although Australia's pretty split as well at the moment. The political dimension is very, very real here in terms of location of events. So without going into the detail, because it gets quite grubby, it's definitely a factor now, which maybe 2-3 years ago it wasn't. So locating in one state may impact whether or not people from another state can come if they're in the public sector, for example.
Wow.
It's a real issue now, whereas before it was just a little bit of a sideshow.
Yes, and well, we're seeing that in different geographies, but also, the challenge here in Australia, of course, is that we're so far away from the rest of the world. So probably for us, the environmental issue is more of a concern in terms of, offsetting carbon to come to Australia to attend these types of events. So, I think there are lots of challenges globally, whether it's environmental, political environment, all of those things, which will impact, these rotations. Interestingly, when we first framed this paper, we sort of we did some of the analysis just after or just in the midst of COVID, and we sort of had put together a sort of perspective of, how this sector would come back. And over the course of getting the paper published and the rounds of review, of course, the sector has come back. So it is resilient, but these challenges will have an impact going forward.
So did you see?
So can I just ask, has it come back to the same level? Because I know in the US it's coming back, but it's not what it was before. What's it like in Australia?
So international visitation is not back yet. I think we're still struggling, and there's border issues around visas and things like that.
Yeah.
And visa processing is an issue, but our markets haven't recovered yet. But probably domestically, we're probably getting back, and certainly domestic travel is.
So it's similar to here then, in a way. Yeah.
Sounds like it's a similar picture everywhere.
It's
It's
the
exactly
world
the question
over. Yeah.
I was going to ask. It's been interesting working with colleagues in China, where exhibitions and associations, so that's got this very regional boosterism dimension to it as well. And there's been a real sense of urgency of trying to get these things back up because they're seen as the engine of development in so many regions. But yeah, everyone seems to be struggling with the same things. If you were going to set out this is like a Viva conversation, isn't it? If you were going to set out a research agenda for where do people go next with this research? You talked about the global piece. What kind of research do you think could come next after this study's been published?
Well, probably the easiest one would be to replicate and with a bigger data set. And if there's colleagues out there who wish to do that, I mean, we can. There's the coding template within the article which shows how we've gone about that process. But I think that statute type analysis that I did talk about. And going back to associations, I think it's really important to go back to associations and probably if possible, at a sort of a cross-country comparison. So, some interviewing with associations based in Europe, America, and other locations based on the data that showed those different patterns, and really to get to some understanding about, what's driving their decision making, and, what are some of the reasons why some of the associations might be more willing to be geographically diverse as opposed to, keeping within a very contained area. So those are some of the insights. But I mean, certainly we did indicate that if there was a robust enough data set, then the opportunity to do some sort of predictive analysis based on that to see, where, based on some predictive variables, these events might end up in the future. That would be very valuable as well.
Yeah, I could see that being really useful for DMOs. Trying to think, is it worth us investing in this and putting in the support and the infrastructure, or are we just not in the conversation for another decade? Is it just never going to come to us again?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you could see if that work was done, some sort of I don't know, almost like an indicator, indicator tool
Yeah.
type thing where you could, just, where's the location, where's it being held, did it plug in, and if you could come up with a calculator almost of
Yeah.
predictive ability, that would be really valuable. But I mean, there'd be lots of variables to take into account of that, and there'd have to be a lot of background work before we get to that point in time.
But lots of material for a new researcher.
Definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah, no, excellent. So, Leonie, just reflecting back on what you said, and when we're saying how we all started, if you were starting now, what areas do you think you would go down? And the other side is, what advice would you give somebody starting in this space now? Because to some extent, it's very different to when we all started 15, 20 years ago.
Yes. Yeah, well, and as I said, I didn't do my PhD on an event-related topic, and even where we are, I mean, we're in a big tourism department at the moment. I think we've got approximately 50 PhD students, but out of that, there's probably only 2 or 3 that are doing event-related topics, which to me is it's not representative of the wider interest in academia around events. So it is a very rich area. I would, for a new academic, really go back to the disciplinary roots to see, how they could potentially inform, concepts and theories around event management. I don't think we've got to a place yet where we have, a very broad set of theoretical frameworks indigenous to the event space that explain what happens within the event experience. There is that opportunity, but I think that needs to be grounded in traditional disciplines. And as we know, our colleague Getz has written a lot about some of those disciplinary bases that might inform event studies. I really encourage that for early career PhD colleagues, because I'm already starting to see, and I'm sure as James and yourselves are as editors and regular reviewers, I'm already starting to see works within our field that don't reference outside of the field, which I think for still a very emergent field of study, that's a real danger if we're just sort of looking very insularly within the field of event management. So to look out to see what we can bring back in and to make our own, I think that's a real message. But it's also a message that there's a lot of scope still within our event management field to make novel contributions, which I think is really promising for younger academics, and they can make things their own, which is also positive as well.
Yeah, that's a really I like the optimistic take on it as well. I think it is an exciting area to be in for that reason, isn't it? It's that there's new ground to be broken, and that's fab. If you were going to recommend something for maybe someone at that early stage, something they should go away and read, something for their bookshelf or their sun lounger, or what do you think people should be reading? Maybe it's an article or something else.
Yeah, well, I think all younger event academics will already be doing this, but all the early works by Getz and just those are the things we continue to reference. I've been doing some work more at the sort of event portfolio space and destination level event management in just recent years. So I've been reading a lot of Greg Richards' work on the eventful city. And I think that's I think that's an interesting concept that yet is still quite empirically limited. There's few studies, but really connecting up, how we can make cities eventful by having a portfolio of strategically managed events, which then align to the longer term development plans of the city. I think there's a lot of merit in that type of concept to tie in a lot of things that we already talk about in terms of legacies, impact management, leveraging, things like that. So that's that's something I'm interested in, but there, as with a lot of our concepts, there's still work to be done.
Yeah.
Do you know, I'm so pleased you said that, because on Monday I start my graduate class, which is destination planning for events, which is exactly what you said. Because when we were we launched an MS event leadership about a year ago, and when we developed it, nothing looks at events from the perspective of the place, and it's how we didn't call it portfolio, but essentially it's what does all this mean for a place. So I was the one that was like, Alan, you can do that. And do you know what? It's probably the best course I've taught for years. I love it, because we have all these event students who just have a very singular focus and they have no idea. So it is one of those courses that you do see the light switch on, which is feels good. But
also
I agree with you fully, Leonie.
Great recommendations as well, because they're a great read. Don Getz and Greg Richards, they're both also great writers, and I think that's something where you can read some of their stuff on a sun lounger. I think definitely the eventful city. We're never really on holiday, are we? Thank you very much for those recommendations. We'll make sure there's links up in the show notes so people can follow those. They can have a look at your paper, but they can have a look at your recommendations as well. Thank you very much for your time with us today. Excellent. That's been a great conversation.
Thanks for staying up, Leonie. I hope it paid off.
I'm very pleased, and hopefully there was some coherence in there at 20 to 11 Australian time. So
absolutely. Thank you for your time, and thank you to our listeners and our viewers, and we'll see you again next time.